Speaker. It's a privilege for me to ride and speak on this topic. And I'm very proud that I'm rising in opposition to Bill C-9, an act respecting the election and terms of office of chiefs and councillors of certain First Nations and the composition of council of those First Nations. And I want to acknowledge at the outset the amazing work done by a colleague of mine from Nanaimo, Cowichan. She has been an amazing advocate for this file, along with my colleague who just spoke ahead from Manitoba. And, you know, I'm a very optimistic and hopeful person. But there are moments when I do get moments of despair. And I think it's when I look at the role of the federal government when it comes to the First Nations people, to our Aboriginals and Inuits. And when I look at that, I think here we are in 2013, 21st century, and we have people living on our First Nations communities that absolutely bring tears to our eyes when we see the way the children live, and we also see the way the communities are surviving. And I've actually had the privilege of visiting many First Nations communities in my previous life. And every time I went to those communities, I was so impressed with a strong feeling of community, with a strong feeling of hope that something is going to change. But also communities that are asking us the biggest question of all: when are things going to change? When are things going to change and get better for First Nations people in many parts of Canada? And since I've been in this House, we've dealt with a lot of pretty tragic cases. Atawapisket is a fine example. The report from the United Nations, another fine example. And all of the information we have is that some urgent action needs to be taken on a whole lot of issues to address concerns with the First Nations people. But I have to tell you, Mr. Speaker, I was pleased when I heard the Prime Minister say that there was going to be a new way, a way of moving forward with our First Nations communities. And, you know, being a hopeful and optimistic person, that actually made me feel good. But since I've been in this House, whether I hear some of my colleagues from the other side, or whether it's in the way our federal government is dealing with the First Nations people, none of that has come to life. What we get are lots of words, and words are good. Words are good because they're the first step. But, Mr. Speaker, it's absolutely imperative that we take the next and the next and the next steps in order to put right wrongs that have existed for hundreds of years. Wrongs that have existed for hundreds of years. This is the 21st century, and we're beyond colonialism, I hope. And we talk about respect for our First Nations, nation-to-nation relationships, nation-to-nation moving forward. But in reality, what we have is more paternalism and more, well, you know, we might have talked with you, and we did, but we know better what's going to work for you. And it's that kind of paternalism that is at the roots of why I am opposed to this piece of legislation. And, you know, there isn't anybody who isn't saying that we need to address some of the problems that exist with the Indian Act and the election provisions in there. We agree that we need to make some changes, but those changes cannot be railroaded and they cannot be imposed. And yes, consultations occurred, but when you've got the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, not just one person, the Assembly of Manitoba chiefs saying that this is not good, this doesn't reflect what we said, then surely it's time to take a breather and to go back and try to build consensus and try to address the concerns that were raised. But instead, we're going to say, well, the government is going to say, well, we talked with you guys. We had these roundtable discussions. You came, and yes, we've actually found that the APC does support this. And we agree the APC supports this. However, there isn't overall support. And to say one group supports it, the other group doesn't, so therefore, here, we're going to do it anyway, seems a little bit top-heavy and unnecessary, when if the government would take time and address some of the issues, we would not have this dilemma today, and if they had even accepted the amendments, we wouldn't be here debating this in this way today. You know, when you look at it, everybody wants to see elections fixed wherever they are, you know, make sure that things go right, and we agree with that. But here you do have the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs saying, this doesn't cut it. And one of the reasons it doesn't cut it is that to opt in to this legislation, this scheme, it just takes a vote by the council. But to opt out, it's a very, very cumbersome affair. Surely opting in and opting out should be similar mechanisms. And the other thing is, the minister, once again, and we know that the ministers under this government love to have more and more power centralized in themselves, into the ministries. But really, in this, the minister can even impose a First Nations group coming into this system, even if they decide not to go in. And that seems way, way over the top, Mr. Speaker, and totally unnecessary. And once again, what it does is it gives far more power to the minister, and in that process, it diminishes the nationhood of the First Nations groups that it impacts. And I think we should be really paying attention to that. The Assembly of First Nations, by the way, when they came and gave witness, and this is what they had to say. This was to the other house. And the AFN told the other house, and this is a quote, "What in fact is missing from our toolbox to move beyond the Indian Act is an effective and simple mechanism for a First Nation to remove its core governance out from under the Indian Act when it is ready, willing and able to do so, and after its citizens have legitimized governance reform through a community referendum." Now, to me, is that really too much to ask for? That seems to capture what would have made the First Nations people support this bill. But instead, we're going to give more power to the minister. Yes, the minister can do this. Yes, the minister can do that. And then the appeals, we're now moving the appeals towards the court system. Court systems that are already overburdened, that are already will be lengthy and cumbersome and expensive process. And, you know, once again, Mr. Speaker, you know, I was so impressed by the ingenuity, and not so much ingenuity, as the First Nations people wanting something similar that we have when it comes to federal and provincial levels of government. All they wanted was the creation of an independent First Nations Elections Tribunal, very similar to Elections Canada. And yet, we cannot even move towards that. So really, Mr. Speaker, during the time I have been here, I have seen legislation after legislation that impacts on First Nations people, and every time I've had to stand up in this House and oppose legislation that, if it was changed to actually respect the nation-to-nation relationship with our First Nations that I could have supported. And this bill would have taken very few amendments to have got my support as well. And as you know, Mr. Speaker, at this time I have to say there are many, many things when it comes to our Aboriginal and First Nations communities, the Indigenous people of Canada, that we should be addressing. And a lot of that comes from identity and who you are. You know, there are huge issues of loss of language. There are huge issues of isolation. But there are also huge issues around identity, but also of not having that independence that is so critical. And with that comes a certain amount of, I would say, mental distress. And as a high school counsellor for years and years, I'm always appalled at the very high levels of suicide amongst our First Nations communities. And all I know, Mr. Speaker, is when things should be getting better, in many ways things are getting worse. And maybe things are getting worse now because we can actually see, because of our new technologies, television, satellites, we can actually see what's happening in some of our remote communities. But I would invite my colleagues across the way, not just to drop in, but actually go there and visit people's houses, not the ones that have, that are sort of being specially careened for you to visit, but go and visit the houses and go and visit some of the seniors and even visit some of the schools. And I would really invite you to do that. But more than that, Mr. Speaker, I would urge our government, I would urge our Prime Minister to live up to the words he gave to the First Nations people. I can remember the look of excitement and anticipation at Chief Atleo's face when the minister made his speech. And I know how full of hope and optimism the First Nations people were that this was a way forward. But I would say since then, the words don't look so shiny. As a matter of fact, they have been muddied. They have been muddied because over and over again, we have not responded to the needs of the First Nations people, nor do we in this House, I should say, nor does this government, despite all its word, respect that nation-to-nation way of moving forward, getting out of colonialism, getting out of paternalistic type of governance and moving into true nation-to-nation governance for our First Nations. Because with that come rights, and we know that with that come responsibilities. But it's very disturbing for me when we hear some of the comments when you talk about the need for example, children who go to school in First Nations schools, surely they should get the same dollar amount as the students who go to public schools K-12 in Canada. And surely, when you have communities up in the north, we have to build into the budgets the cost of heating and transportation, because if we do not, that once again takes away from the dollars that can be used to educate our First Nations children. Mr. Speaker, we have a huge, huge responsibility as a nation. As a nation. As a country, Canada has given me lots. Not only my beautiful children and grandchildren, but it's given me an opportunity to have a wonderful life, and now to teach for many years, and now to be here as a Member of Parliament. And I could not live with myself if sitting in this House, I did not use my voice to advocate for our First Nations people. Not in place of them, because we have colleagues in here from the First Nations community sitting on this side who will be speaking and have spoken. But I believe every single one of us, as Canadians, we have a responsibility to set things right. We have it within us. We have it within us. We have the words. What we need now is the will to take action, and meaningful action, not just words for the sake of words that sound good when you have a camera shot, but actually taking real steps to build a strong, meaningful relationship with our First Nations people. And our First Nations people own territories that are very, very rich in resources. But I also know that they are very, very concerned about the environment. And as each and every one of us should be, because if we only talk about extraction of resources without thinking about the impact it's having on us globally, then I think we do our children a huge disservice. So I think we need to pay special attention to our First Nations people who are raising red flags, who come on television and say, look around us, the ice is melting, folks. This is not a textbook issue anymore. It's real, it's happening around them. And we need to pay special attention. But we also need to pay special attention that what we're talking about are First Nations people, are our Aboriginals and our Inuits. And as our Prime Minister has made a commitment on building a relationship nation to nation, we need to have real action to take us forward in that direction. And getting back to this piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, could you tell me how much longer I've got? Oh my goodness, I'm running out of time and I still have so much to say. Let me tell you, Mr. Speaker, that I'm from the province of course, beautiful British Columbia. Every one of our provinces is beautiful, all our territories and regions. But of course, BC, because it's my home province, also has as its emblem beautiful British Columbia. And most of my knowledge of First Nations and the communities is about British Columbia. And I want to let you know that even from British Columbia, Jody Wilson-Raybould, BC Regional Chief, Assembly of First Nations, had this to say on Clause 3. These provisions essentially give the Minister the ability to impose core governance rules on a First Nation. Let's pay attention to that. Impose core governance rules on a First Nation, which, if ever used, would be resented by that First Nation, would not have been seen as legitimate in the eyes of that nation, and would probably add fuel to an already burning fire. Ultimately, each nation must and will take responsibility for its own governance, including elections. I could not put that more eloquently than my friend Jody. And when Jody says that, it's not just light words used. It actually makes common sense. As a teacher, one thing I learned is that when you're teaching children, you're not talking at them, you're working with them, with their learning. If we know that about children, here we're talking about nations, the First Nations. And surely when we're talking about First Nations, we cannot in the 21st century be so paternalistic and so think that we know better than you. And even though 50% of the group we consulted with was opposed to the changes we're making, we're going to make them anyway. Surely, Mr. Speaker, this is the time for common sense to prevail, for my colleagues to oppose this bill. Let's send it back, get it fixed, so all of us can support it and respect the nation-to-nation commitment that this Prime Minister made to the First Nations people not so long ago. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable